thank you, everybody, and thank you especially to Sandy and David. I attended the Summer Institute 2 years ago, which would have been, did we skip 14?
No, that was the 14th.
So that was the 14th. Okay, so I attended the 14th as a participant. I didn't give a talk, and I fell in love with the event. I fell in love with the campus here. I fell in love with the cafeteria, especially the pastry bar, the omelet bar. I would still be in college if my university offered that. So when the institute was postponed or delayed for a year, I felt I was worried. I was worried that it was going to go away permanently. I'm glad that it's back, and I hope that it's a going concern moving forward. So I am Scott Scheall. I'm from Arizona State University. I teach in the Science, Technology, and Society department. David told me today is all about Adam Smith. My talk is not really in any way connected to Adam Smith, but I did promise David that I would mention Adam Smith, so here I am. I'm mentioning, quote, Adam Smith. I am mentioning Adam Smith. Actually, there is a slide later on in which I reference the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers. So in a sense, maybe we can make it work. Okay. Although I have to say, I am not a PowerPoint guy. Okay, so I'm a philosopher by profession. I teach philosophy classes. When I first started teaching years ago, I relied on PowerPoint extensively, and I soon realized that in a philosophy class, when you use PowerPoint, students pay no attention to you whatsoever. They just focus on the PowerPoint, and they scribble, and they look at the PowerPoint, and they pay no attention to your words. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I just stopped using PowerPoint altogether and forced my students to actually listen to my words when I speak. So PowerPoint is a new tool for me. And when I realized that I was going to have 75 minutes to fill up today, I thought, well, I better put together something with entertainment value, right? So, but I think actually I may have gone a little bit overboard because my slide presentation has 213 slides. The older version of PowerPoint didn't have all of these awesome toys that the newer version of PowerPoint does, and these transition things and these animations that you can do. And so I got a little bit carried away with putting together this amazing PowerPoint presentation. But I actually don't think I'm going to rely on it too extensively because, well, I just don't think I need to. And more than anything, I want you all to feel welcome to offer comments, questions during my presentation. So please don't feel compelled to wait to the end of the talk. Feel free to raise your hand whenever you like. So, but I will rely on the PowerPoint here for probably the first couple of minutes. So moving forward, what do I do? What is it that I do? What is it that I'm interested in? Well, I'm a philosopher, like I said, a philosopher of science by training, and I'm really interested in Hayek. I'm interested in other things as well, but Hayek mainly. And what I am trying to do is to advance the Hayekian research program, by which I mean I think there's a lot of interesting historical questions about Hayek, and I engage with those as well. But I also think there's a Hayekian philosophy that can be used as a tool to do new sorts of things with. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to actually use Hayek's ideas in new and original ways. Although I will say that the paper I'm presenting today is probably the least original thing you can imagine, because really I'm just synthesizing a whole bunch of Hayek's ideas. But that's what I'm interested in doing. And so advancing the Hayekian research program, as I sort of conceive this idea, has two elements. One is a matter of clarification, just clarifying Hayek's ideas and how they're related to each other. The other element is trying to extend those ideas in new ways and into new different arenas. So what do I mean when I say clarifying Hayek's ideas and their interrelations? Well, at the center of Hayek's research program, as I conceive it, is an epistemology, a view of social order as knowledge coordination. This, I think, is the central Hayekian idea, and it's this idea that I think needs some additional clarification, and once it's clarified, I think it can be extended in various different ways. So this epistemology, as it plays out in Hayek's research program, sort of figures in three different areas: in methodology of the sciences of complex phenomena, in the social sciences and economics. Oh, I forgot about this. Oh, hold on, wait a minute. Oh, right, I forgot. See, I put together this beautiful thing and I completely forgot what I was going to do. I know, but the basic idea is that at the core of Hayek's research program is this epistemology, and it sort of cashes out in three different areas: social sciences, economics, methodology, and political philosophy. And I'm trying to bring these ideas, trying to clarify how this epistemology operates in these three different areas. Now, the one area in which I've not done any work so far is in social sciences and economics. And I think what needs to be clarified there is we need to develop the Hayekian theory in such a way that we can disentangle spontaneous from organized elements of a given social order. And once we're in a position to do that, we should be able to identify and evaluate both positive orders and negative orders. And we should also be in a better position to answer this question: what, if anything, can we do to encourage the latter and avoid or correct the former? So that, I think, is probably the biggest problem that needs to be resolved in the Hayekian research program. Is we've got this, I think most people would agree, we've got this brilliant idea of spontaneous order that Hayek develops, but there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more potential sort of under the surface that Hayek didn't get to in his own lifetime, and that, as I understand modern Hayekians, there's a lot of historical work done about Hayek, but there's not as much sort of new development of Hayekian ideas as I would like to see. So that's sort of what I am doing. So that's an area in which I hope to work eventually, but I have not done a great deal of work so far. The projects that I'm working on right now really involve extending Hayek's ideas in two different arenas. One is Hayekian political epistemology. And Hayekian political epistemology, here we get a little bit more Adam Smith, an inquiry into the nature and causes of political ignorance. And it's not just an inquiry into the nature and causes of political ignorance, it's an inquiry into the nature and causes and implications and possible remedies of political ignorance. So, Hayekian epistemology. What do policymakers know? What do they need to know? Sandy's laughing. She knows the answer. I know the answer. I think you all probably know the answer. But what do they need to know in order to do some of the things that they're charged with doing? And that's what I'm trying to develop. I'm trying to extend Hayek's ideas. So Hayekian political epistemology really starts from an idea that runs throughout Hayek's work, and this is the idea that the case for freedom really is an epistemological case. Okay? The best case for individual freedom is the fact that we're ignorant. Okay? And there's another quote from the Constitution of Liberty: if we're to understand how society works, we must attempt to define the general nature and range of our ignorance concerning it. Though we cannot see in the dark areas, or though we cannot see in the dark, we must be able to at least trace the limits of the dark areas. So that's what I'm trying to do, is trying to trace the limits of the dark areas of political ignorance. What do policymakers know? What do they need to know? What happens when there's a gap between those two things? So I'm right now, I've just finished the first draft of a book that I will be presenting actually in a manuscript workshop at Mercatus next week. Politics as a Knowledge Problem, F.A. Hayek and the Epistemic Burden of Effective Policymaking. And it's really about Hayek's use of what I call the argument from ignorance. And this is the argument that you see all over the Hayekian canon. He applies it against central planning, against scientism, against countercyclical monetary policy. It's basically the idea, the most famous version of it is the socialist calculation version, and it's basically the socialist planners don't possess the knowledge they need to possess in order to make socialism work. Okay, that's the argument from ignorance. He applies a similar idea to scientism and a similar idea to Keynesian macro. The problem, however, is, or at least as I argue, there's a tension, an inconsistency between Hayek's use of the argument from ignorance and his own positive program for classical liberalism. Hayek makes no case that the policymakers in his ideal liberal order would possess the knowledge necessary to make that work. or that they would be in a position within that order in order to govern effectively. So that's what my book is basically about. His use of the argument from ignorance, where he's applying it as a cudgel against socialists and defenders of the scientific approach and Keynesians, but also applying it, what I'm doing is applying it to his own ideas, and I also apply it to other positive political philosophies, Rawls, Nozick. If any of you know Ted Burchak's post-Hayekian socialism, I discuss that. Robust political economy I look at. And I argue in each of those cases that Hayek's argument from ignorance confronts, those political philosophies basically don't have an answer to Hayek's argument from ignorance. So that's what Hayekian political philosophy is. It basically leads to a conclusion of policy skepticism. But policy skepticism is not equivalent to any extant political philosophy, liberal or otherwise. And my argument is essentially that we need a political philosophy that's consistent with the limits of political knowledge, and that's what I'm trying to develop, is a political philosophy that does not extend beyond the limits of what policymakers know. Okay? Now, so that's one project that I'm working on. The second project that I'm working on is Hayekian philosophy of science, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. My paper, Kinds of Scientific Rationalism, the Case for Methodological Liberalism, is an attempt to develop a Hayekian philosophy of science. Now, I should mention that the paper that I'm giving today, the way that I'm conceiving of it, is that it's really a précis of another book that I'm going to write a couple years down the road. So each part of the paper, the way I'm thinking about it, is going to be a chapter in the final book. Now, this book is going to have both historical and philosophical elements. The historical elements are really going to address Hayek's engagement with the community of 20th century philosophers of science. So Hayek in the 1920s in Vienna is very close to certain members of the Vienna Circle. He's enemies with certain others. Of course, at the same time, he's also engaged in the Mises crisis, so he's getting that sort of methodological perspective from there. It was an interesting thing to think about Hayek. At one point, probably sometime in the 1920s, I think you could make a case that he has to be considered the most knowledgeable philosopher of economics in the world, if only because he's the only person who's in that milieu who's getting it from the positivist side and also from the Misesian side. So he's right there in the middle. So I would make that case that in the 1920s, he's probably the most knowledgeable methodologist in the world. Now, what happens when he moves to the LSE, I don't know. We're not going to talk about that. But part of the historical tale that I want to tell in this book is about Hayek's engagement with the Vienna Circle, and then also later with Popper and Polanyi and Feyerabend and Hutchison and people like that. The argument that I'm essentially presenting to you today, it has a number of different elements, but one of the theses that I'm presenting is that a Hayekian philosophy of science, properly understood, offers what is essentially an error theory of those other 20th century philosophies of science, in particular positivism and sort of a naive falsificationism. You could even make the case that a more sophisticated falsificationism falls prey to a Hayekian philosophy of science as well, but I'm not going to push that point. So when I say Hayekian philosophy of science, what do I mean? I'm really talking about science as a spontaneous order, or, as back to Smith, an invisible hand process. Now, there is what I'm asking is, what if the phenomena of science are complex in Hayek's sense? And so, essentially, all I'm doing in this paper is taking Hayek's methodology of sciences of complex phenomena and applying it to science itself. I'm treating science itself as a complex phenomena and trying to draw out various implications from Hayek's theory of complex phenomena for how science would operate if it were a complex phenomena. And then I'm basically arguing that, well, it would have all of these properties 1, 2, 3, you might say. And then I argue, well, let's look out at the world and how science actually is and see if science embodies those properties. Does it actually have those properties? And I argue that it does. So it's something of an inference to the best explanation, or an abductive argument. I'm basically saying, well, look, a Hayekian philosophy of science would look like this, or science would look like this according to a Hayekian philosophy of science. Science actually does look something like that. Therefore, we have some reason to accept a Hayekian philosophy of science. Now, if the phenomena of science are complex in Hayek's sense, these are basically the three conclusions that I argue for in the paper. What we get from that perspective is we get a meta-methodology. And according to this meta-methodology, there are multiple kinds of scientific rationality: constructivist rationality and ecological rationality. And what I argue is that those 20th century philosophies of science that I mentioned, logical positivism, naive falsificationism, basically fail because they do not recognize the existence of multiple kinds of rationality. They're all constructivists about these things. They don't recognize the possibility of ecologically rational outcomes in science. And that, I argue, is one of their failings. Finally, the last conclusion I draw is that if there are ecologically rational outcomes in science, then there are cases in which coercion cannot be an effective scientific method. Okay? There are cases in which you cannot coerce, and we can talk about what we mean by coercion in a scientific sort of context. There are cases in which you cannot coerce scientific success, basically, if science is indeed ecologically rational. And of course, Hayek ties coercion, or the absence of coercion, directly to liberty. So I'm arguing that what we get is a view that I call methodological liberalism, which is basically the idea that if we want these ecologically rational scientific outcomes to emerge, which presumably we do, then we have to treat science with a degree of liberalism. Okay? So in a sense, it's not, I mean, it has a normative component, but it's not meant to be a normative argument. It's meant to be a description of how science operates, and basically with the claim that if you want science to continue to operate that way, you have to treat it in this liberal sort of way. Okay. So that's where we are. Now, I should mention that there are predecessors to my argument here. Of course, Polanyi argues for something similar. Tulloch in the Organization of Inquiry argues for something similar. Walter Weimer, does anybody know who Walter Weimer is? Walter Weimer was a psychologist by training, I believe. I think he taught Bill Butos, if I'm correct. He was at Penn State for many years. But Walter Weimer, for a Hayekian, what Walter Weimer is famous for is, Weimer was basically the one that brought Hayek into the world of modern psychology. So he was the first one to notice the sensory order, really, as a proto-connectionist theory of cognition. So Weimer was the one who was responsible for that, for sort of promoting the sensory order as a live theory of cognition. Our colleague Tim Leonard has a paper that came out in 2002 called Rules in Science, Science is an Invisible Hand Process, something like that, I believe. It's a great paper. That actually is much more of a Adam Smith invisible hand sort of approach to science. It's a wonderful paper. I highly recommend it. Bill Butos is doing ongoing research with Roger Koppel and also Tom McQuaid on this question. What they're really doing is, so whereas I'm really sort of interested in the methodological or meta-methodological implications of science as a spontaneous order, what Butos, Koppel, and McQuaid are really doing is actually developing models of science as a spontaneous order. They're doing some very interesting work. And lastly, I'll mention our colleague, my friend Vlad Tarko, has a working paper on polycentrism and science. Yes?
This might be a good place to ask this, but since you mentioned Tim Leonard's
yes.
paper, that grew out of his dissertation.
Yes, right.
Palmer, which grew out of Palmer's engagement with McCloskey, and I noticed McCloskey's name not on your list, and I was wondering, a lot of the themes that you're working with, especially methodological liberalism, resonate a lot with McCloskey's.
Yeah, I haven't thought very much about that. I don't have a response, but I will revisit Deirdre's work And I mean, you're talking about the rhetoric stuff, right?
Rhetoric stuff, which is interesting in light of the bourgeois virtue work that's come later, because reading it backwards,
Yeah, I actually,
bourgeois virtue of scientific practice.
yeah, I don't know what to make of some of Deirdre's recent work in the light of the rhetoric stuff, if only because it seems like she's making a case that extends beyond rhetoric. It's more of a, an evidence-based case that she's making, and so I wonder whether, has she given up the rhetoric view? Officially, has she? She's tired of it. Okay. Well, yeah, that's a good suggestion. I'll go back and look at that. My initial reaction is that while there might be a connection, the rhetoric stuff, for my tastes, tends a little bit too much to a relativism, sort of a cognitive relativism, and I don't think a Hayekian approach does. So I might resist on that dimension. Okay, so yes. Oh, David.
One way to think about what Deirdre's doing recently is if you widen the number of people you talk to, like this is sort of part of bourgeois virtues, this is consistent with the concept of mutation. But if you widen the number of people you talk to, the number of nodes in go up real fast. And so what she needs to get the jump essentially is a real strong increasing returns thing popping in right there. And why would it pop in right there? Well, you're starting to talk to lots more people. And so you're talking to just not an aristocratic group, and so you've got the jump can be done in a standard increasing return stuff as long as you've got some reason to believe you're talking to more people. I think that's not inconsistent with the older stuff. I mean, I teased her, I tease her all the time, but I tease her because she hasn't written down a model. She hasn't written down a model where the number of nodes going up, right there.
Well, she has a paper in a recent anthology that came out, Hayek in Behavioral Economics, that I wrote a review for the JHEAD that's coming out in a couple of months. And her argument in that paper is basically, she essentially makes an evidence-based case, as I read her, she's making an evidence-based case for Austrian economics, which is fine. I like Austrian economics, but there's no mention of rhetoric whatsoever in the.
David's point, though, is that it's connected to talk in the evidence. So the point is that for her, that the economic history involves a significant increase in talking.
Right.
So that's one connection to rhetoric.
Yeah, well, I would have to go back and read that paper with that idea in mind, but it didn't strike me as, I didn't see the connection. Yes?
Are you able to offer evidence of analysis for your postulate?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Are you able to offer evidence or analysis for your postulate?
The evidence for the postulate is that it bears these implications that science seems to manifest.
Science in the last 400 years has been massively promoted by governments at
Right.
bottom-up.
Yeah. The conclusion is not that coercion never works. The conclusion is that there are cases in which it doesn't work.
Yeah, but so I'm just trying to understand what the status of the postulate is. Is it an empirical thing?
It's an assumption for the sake of argument. At this point, I haven't gotten to the argument yet. So at this point, I'm just assuming it to see what we can get out of it. And then we'll look at what we can get out of it, and if what we can get out of it is interesting, then I take that to be some evidence for the postulate. I agree, the postulate, keep in mind, like I said, this is a perceived for a future book, and I will address that sort of question. The postulate needs some independent evidence in its favor, I agree. But that's not what I'm doing at this point in the project, okay? So, right, I'm gonna switch now to a handout that I've used in the past when I've given this talk, because I think it actually is a lot clearer than relying on 200 more slides. Yes?
I guess, Eric remarked, Samuelson's 50th sentence came to my mind. Science is a convention agreed upon.
Yeah. I think that's that.
Nothing spontaneous about it. It's conventional.
Well, I'm not sure, how can that not be spontaneous? Conventions can't arise spontaneously? Okay. So we're going to start with the postulate that the phenomena of science are complex in Hayek's sense. And like I said, I'm just assuming that for the sake of argument right now. We're not going to worry about what evidence what evidence there might be in its support. So what follows from that postulate? Well, first of all, what does Hayek mean by complex phenomena? What does he mean by complex orders? Well, a complex order emerges from the interrelations between rules, or more exactly, rule-guided behavior, and particular environmental circumstances. So a social order is just simply a complex order where the elements happen to be conscious organisms. Okay, so there are complex orders that are non-social. He talks about, for example, the formation of galaxies, an example of an emergent complex order. But where we're dealing with conscious organisms, where orders emerge from the activities, the rule-guided behavior of conscious organisms, we're dealing with social orders. So an implication of that definition is that a scientific order is just going to be a social order, the elements of which are those conscious organisms that happen to follow those rules of science. Okay, and again, I'm not going to specify what the rules of science are at this point in the project, but just for the sake of, that's how Hayek defines different orders, is in terms of the rules that the elements follow. So a scientific order is just going to be an order where the elements follow scientific rules. Okay, another definition.
I don't understand, I'm sorry, but
Go ahead.
how you cannot define the rules of science as opposed to any other human activity. So suppose we say, rather than scientific order, we talk about a culinary order, we talk about culinary order, or chefs that follow, the rules of culinary activity.
Sure.
So what's, and you don't, you start up there, phenomenon in science, but you don't define science. So how do you distinguish science from any other activities that humans or even living beings are doing?
It's not clear to me why I need to define that right now, at this point in the project.
Well, why focus on science as opposed to anything else that's human? And what underlying concerns me is there's some underlying notion that's by some people that science is getting the truth, and that's sort of one criteria for what it is.
So I mean,
would distinguish science from, say, French cooking, and you're not.
different rules.
But that's what I'm saying. It seems to be arbitrary to focus on science as opposed to any other activity that living organisms are engaged in.
And I guess I would say that it is arbitrary. I could tell you a similar story about if we wanted, we could talk about culinary orders. I mean, the point is just that Hayek defines different orders in terms of the rules that the elements follow. Okay, so for now, I'm just going to say that the scientific order are those orders that the elements of which are people that follow the rules of science.
You could say that Hayek didn't really treat science because he didn't see why it should get priority over any other human activity.
Well, I mean,
People might disagree with that. Deirdre would probably disagree with that, but that's why I'm a little bit bothered here that you're just sort of jumping into science without defining what it is or what scientific rules are.
well, but this is a philosophy of science. So it's a way of defining science. And what you're asking me to do is to define science before I've even offered you the philosophy yet. Okay, so
I don't know. How can you have a philosophy of something you don't know what you're... It seems to me there's a circularity somehow. I don't know. Anyway,
What makes the rules of science distinguishable from other rules?
for the time being, right now, I mean, for the time being, all I can say to you is that those are the rules that the scientists follow. Okay, I mean, I can't, it's an empirical question which those are. Okay, so what I'm offering here is basically a theory that might help you to do that empirical investigation. Okay, so that may be one way that I answer your question, is that this is a theory, it's a tool that allows us to do empirical investigations of science. I mean, what I'm trying to offer here, what Hayek's meta-methodology leads to is something of a science of science, okay? And this is the theoretical part of that science. The empirical part of the science is something that no one has done yet.
Scott, you put Hayek in conversation with Popper and Giuliani and Zoller, and all of them are concerned about the demarcation problem. So how can we distinguish science from astrology, and sciences from practices that purport to be science but are not science? And it's a bit disingenuous, I think, to say, oh, I'm just going to take the self-reports of people with a badge on their neighbor under a thing and say, oh, we're doing science, not look at what they're doing. If the whole issue is apart, can we make some normative claims about distinguishing between the two? And I think that that's what Nietzsche is putting his finger on.
Yeah, I'm not, okay, so I think we might be putting the cart before the horse here. The demarcation criteria is an implication of a philosophy of science, okay? You don't start with a demarcation criteria, you draw a demarcation criteria out of a particular sort of view about how science operates. I'm offering a view of how science operates, so to the extent that there is any sort of demarcation criteria that falls out of this, it's going to be a conclusion and not a premise of the argument.
But the concern is that it's not clear if you're doing an empirical study of the phenomenon or you're giving us some kind of normative idea, which are really being extremely ambiguous about the status of this postulate.
For the time being, all I'm doing is offering definitions and drawing implications from those definitions. Sure, we'll move forward. So, like I said, I'm just starting taking definitions here and drawing out implications from this. So the second definition that we need to worry about is what constitutes a progressive mutation of a system of rules. Well, according to Hayek, progressive mutation is one that simply increases the number of elements that follow the system of rules. And an implication of that is that a scientific order progresses when a change in the system of rules from which it emerges leads to more scientists following the mutated system of rules. Now, my sort of one semi-original modification here is to relativize that notion of progressiveness or stasis or regressiveness to what's going on in the other social orders in which a scientific order is embedded. Okay, so think of a scientific order, the scientific order of economics. Well, whether economics is progressing or regressing or static depends on what's going on in the other social orders in which it is embedded. So if social science is progressing, but natural science is progressing at a much higher rate than social science is, then this sort of adjustment, this modification allows us to make sort of judgments about the relative progressiveness of different disciplines, sub-disciplines, research traditions, et cetera, within a social order. Okay. So one other thing that follows from Hayek's theory of complex phenomena is that a full explanation of some complex phenomena requires more knowledge than we possess. That's basically how he defines complex phenomena. An implication of that is that if the phenomena of science are complex in Hayek's sense, then an explanation of science will be an explanation of the principle. Our predictions of how science operates will be pattern predictions. Stated another way, if the phenomena of science are complex, then there will be ecologically rational scientific outcomes, where a rational outcome, whether we're in the context of justification or the context of discovery, it's an old philosophical distinction. A rational outcome in the context of justification is just a rational belief. Excuse me. And a rational outcome in the context of discovery is a scientific discovery. So there will be outcomes in those different contexts. If the phenomena of science are complex, there will be outcomes in those different contexts that are ecologically rational, that are emergent, essentially, okay? That cannot be reconstructed discursively. Yes?
You said that there's knowledge that we cannot possess, but is that what Hayek's saying, or is it knowledge that cannot be condensed?
Sorry?
Is it knowledge that we cannot knowledge is out there. Each of the individual agents has a little piece of it, but it can't be condensed to the point that it can be articulated by a quote-unquote expert.
So first of all, the knowledge is not necessarily out there. Okay, so go back to competition as a discovery procedure. Competition creates the knowledge. Science, in this case, creates much of the knowledge. So the knowledge is not something that is out there, exogenous to the process itself. So knowledge itself is created in virtue of the process. So it's not the case that it's just out there waiting to be discovered. I mean, some of it is, sure, but there are other bits of knowledge that are produced endogenously by the process itself. Okay, so that's the first thing to keep in mind. So yeah, that's the answer to the question. There is knowledge, when it comes to complex phenomena, there is knowledge that we just simply don't possess. Now again, there is knowledge that is tacit. There's knowledge that we do possess that we don't know that we possess, and that is certainly central to the question as well. I haven't quite figured out whether to worry, how to worry about tacit knowledge. I haven't figured out how to worry about tacit knowledge as how to treat that, whether we treat that as something that we're ignorant of, or whether we treat that as something that we're not ignorant of, but we just don't know how to access. And I'm not sure whether it makes much of a difference for my purposes. I haven't figured that out yet. But for the time being, all that we need to keep in mind is that if science is complex, then our attempts to explain science are always going to be limited. They're going to be limited to explanations of the principle. Okay? Now, here's an empirical claim. The explanations offered by the logical positivists, naive falsificationists, and post-Quinean irrationalists. By this, I have in mind certain members of the sociology of scientific knowledge community. They all assumed that rational scientific outcomes, at least in the context of justification, that is to say, beliefs, scientific beliefs, are amenable to a full explanation. These writers were all constructivists about science, or what Hayek described as defenders of the scientific approach, who denied that there are ecologically rational scientific outcomes. So what follows from this? Well, if the phenomena of science are complex, in Hayek's sense, which means that there are emergent complex phenomena, that there are ecologically rational scientific outcomes, then any philosophy of science, like the philosophies offered by the positivists, the naive falsificationists, and the sociologists of science, is going to fail, because they're going to miss that ecologically rational element. If they treat science as being entirely amenable to a full reconstruction, that is to say, if they are constructivists about science, they're going to miss those ecologically rational scientific outcomes. Okay? So,
I'm really bought this term ecologically rational. I know Vernon Smith's article on constructive versus ecological rationality. It makes sense in that context, but in the context here, I'm not sure what it means. And you talk about rational scientific outcomes. We go back to the question, how do we distinguish astrology from astronomy? Is one more rational than the other, or how do we...
That's not relevant to my question.
Well, but you're using the term ecologically rational. What does that mean to be rational ecologically in this context? So we have this group of people doing stuff versus different groups of people doing stuff. How do we determine if one is ecologically rational, if the other one is... From a Hayekian
perspective, it just means ordered. Okay, rational just means ordered, and there are two ways in which phenomena can be ordered. It can be ordered either deliberately, it can be organized, or it can be spontaneous. Or I guess there are three ways, because it can be combined. It can be entangled.
What's your criteria for order?
I'm not worried about that right now. Hayek didn't offer a criteria for ordered. I mean, there are a lot of things. Again, let me say, this is a précis of a future book that I plan to write over the course of the next few years. And there are a lot of questions that you're raising that are good questions, but that I simply can't answer right now because the project is not complete. Yes?
I think that there is one more aspect in Hayek's writings that can help you in this evidence thing. And it is that we always try to figure out the function of Steve order
Right.
in extended society. It's what Steve Horvitz did for his spontaneous order of family project. He first tried to figure out what's the functions of the family in the spontaneous order of society. So maybe you should find out some hierarchy, right? What is the function of science in society, and you will,
Right.
on the way, answer these remarks.
Right. So I mean, some of the questions that you're raising can be answered by looking at Bill Butos's work on this question. And this is sort of exactly what Butos is doing, Butos and Koppel and McQuaid. In fact, I should give more credit to McQuaid because he does a lot of that on his own. But so what they do is basically develop these models of science as spontaneous or emergent. And their argument, in one of their papers, their argument is basically that the analog to the price system in a scientific order, the signaling device, is reputation. Okay? So reputation, publication in journals, getting better jobs, getting promotions, those sorts of signals act as analogs to what the prices do in a competitive system. They signal other people within the order how to respond, essentially, how to adapt to changes in the order. And they have a, I don't think they call it they don't talk about function, but I mean, the basic idea is that there is a teleological element to scientific orders, and you know, I don't think they commit themselves. I don't recall if they commit themselves to, you know, the function is like truth finding or something like that. But I mean, that's one way in which you could, you know, tell the story. Yeah. Okay, so so far so good. Hopefully, I mean, basically all that we've done so far, like I said, is just draw out some very simple implications from some definitions. Okay, and I'm aware of the fact that there are many gaps in this, but all I'm worried about is just taking some definitions. Go ahead, David.
Maybe I think you're doing something stronger than you think. Because if you can make an ecological rational case, that doesn't speak to the issues of private versus social, right? It is privately beneficial, like a reputation by, say, underreporting the estimation technique, or something like that.
Right.
Okay, so that may be ecologically rational because nobody can catch me, right? Okay, then using that machinery, then you can map to all of the private versus social stuff, and then you can then speak to what others is worried about an implication. Which is of course telecentric, right? Is that is ecologically rational, and that astronomy is going to look just like astrology.
Right.
And so that with this machinery, you can then map to a very dense literature on private social kind of stuff. And then maybe the demarcation stuff that bothers people so long can then be viewed in the traditional private social stuff that we've been working on since Plato.
Right.
Or something like that.
Yeah, one of the things that I emphasize in the paper, although I don't have it up here on this handout, is that another reason to think that there's something substantive to a Hayekian philosophy of science, it's not just that the positivists were constructivists and that they missed out on the possibility of ecologically rational scientific outcomes. It's also that this group, the positivists and the falsificationists, focused exclusively on evidentiary sort of questions. It was all about, you know, rational scientific belief was all about the evaluation of evidence, different ways in which we evaluate evidence, and they completely ignored the entire social aspect of science. And so it was when the post-Quinean irrationalists came along, the sociology of scientific knowledge folks, people like Barnes and Bloor and Bruno Latour and those guys, when they came along, what they did was basically make the opposite mistake. they focused exclusively on social considerations. That's part of what led them to this sort of relativism. They focused exclusively on sociological considerations and denied that there was any sort of evidentiary element involved. So one of the things that I like about a Hayekian philosophy of science, one of the reasons that I think it's an improvement on sociology of science and sort of narrow empiricist philosophy of science, is that it forces you to focus both on the social aspect of science and on the evaluative, evidentiary evaluative aspects of science. Yes, David?
Well, that's why skipping over the literature missing Smollett's book has been such a disaster.
Right. Now, I want to say something about demarcation criteria here since it's been brought up. I actually don't think you're not going to get you're not going to be able to draw out of a Hayekian philosophy of science a Popperian-like demarcation criteria that says to you, science is all of this and not that. It's not going to fall out of this perspective. What you're going to get is a view of society in which there is sort of an overall social order and different overlapping orders within society. And some of those are going to be more ordered, by which we mean more rational. Some of them are going to be less ordered, more disordered, by which we mean less rational. And so all we're going to be able to see is some things that display very tight patterns and others that display no patterns or very loose patterns, you might say. And we're not going to be able to say, I mean, if you want, you could say, well, the very tightly patterns are more like science than not, but I don't think you have to say that. Yes?
I mean, what you're really doing is philosophy of knowledge in general, then. It's not philosophy of science, because that does have the demarcation problem straight away. I think that's the problem here. And just
Well, no, I don't, I mean, I would, that's not,
like you say,
modern philosophers of science don't worry about demarcation. I mean, demarcation is,
I would argue they do.
Would agree on the fact that you see Chicago versus Chicago Press 2015. I mean, it's the hottest topic because of creation science, climate science.
yeah, I don't know, maybe I'm,
Because it comes back to, otherwise, this is just philosophy of everything, philosophy of cooking, of chess, of astrology, of religion. There's no, if you want to call philosophy of science, you have to say why it's only philosophy of science and not philosophy of everything that humans do. But just a quick question though, just because you're saying that not having this middle ground between the positivist and the rational view, why have you talked about the Lakatosian, like the research
because I actually think that those views can be assimilated to a view like this. So I think that as you go along, in 20th century philosophy of science, you get to Lakatos, you get to Quine, you get to Kuhn. I think Kuhn is easily assimilable to this sort of a view. This is the sort of the work that I want to do in the book that I've not done yet. But that's exactly why I'm not mentioning Lakatos, because I don't think that they make the same mistake that the Vienna Circle and the Popperians did, the early Popperians.
So you broadly agree with, you think this system is in agreement with those philosophers?
I think that it can be assimilated. I mean, I think that, okay, Lakatos, yeah, I don't.
You use the terminology of progressiveness and regressive, and to say that without that is like a
Yeah, but progressive is, I mean, the Vienna Circle talks about progress too. I mean, that's a very common.
But specifically that kind of the organic, like the growing of a research program, or degeneration.
Right.
I think that's
Okay. All right, so other questions? Yes.
I've got another issue with, going back to David's point about public versus private, that's the issue here. Let's suppose we address the demarcation issue, we have this group called scientists and so on. We still have back in the old days, what we called the William Proxmire Golden Fleece issue. So do we really need 2,000 more articles on the sex life of slugs and earthworms and so on? Is this really, relevant goal. What is the relevant goal? And that's, so there's still this issue of wanting some sort of social goal. If we have a policy issue, should society be devoting more resources to this thing?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it just this sort of pointless rent-seeking? Basically, is it simply a rent-seeking activity?
I'm not. What's the question?
Well, I guess the question is, are you going to tell us about this last thing about the relevant goal, or how does Hayek think societies define what the relevant goal is?
So that has nothing to do with, I think, what you're asking. This is a definition from Hayek, okay? This is a definition that states that effective social control, our ability to control society, requires that we possess knowledge that allows us to do so. That's all that says. Effective social control requires knowledge adequate to the realization of the relevant goal. So if we want to provide universal health care, then we need the knowledge necessary to do so. If we want to, build a new highway system, we need to possess the knowledge necessary to do so. That's all that says. And this is just Hayek's point about the connection between prediction and control.
Right, but the whole issue of how a relevant goal is defined I think that's a challenging issue of where that comes from. And that seems sort of central to, how one defines it. And that's like why if we don't do that, then we have these like Foxmeyer type golden fleece issues. Aren't we just look this activity, this pointless activity, it could be progressive if more and more people are doing it. Because scientists like to go to the
So Proxmire's Golden Fleece Awards had to do with what? Remind me. It was about they were awards that were given out to different recipients of government grants that were seemed to be particularly wasteful and silly. Right? Okay. I have no idea what that has to do with this. I have no idea whatsoever.
Again, it's how do we distinguish science as progressive versus just sort of mindless rent-seeking?
Well, according to Hayek, again, you have to keep in mind this is intended to be a descriptive account of science with very little normative bearing. Okay, so when Hayek says that that a social order progresses when it grows, that doesn't mean to say that concept of progress is obviously a non-normative concept of progress. It's just accounting. Okay, so which is the most dominant social order? It's the largest one. Which is the most progressive one? It's the one that's growing at the fastest rate. That could be. I mean, I'll give you an example. I think maybe of what you're talking about. When I gave this paper a couple of months ago at George Mason, Pete Betke asked me, well, but here's a weird implication. The Keynesian revolution would count as progress on Hayek's definition of, or what I'm attributing to Hayek's definition of scientific progress. And I said, right. That's exactly right. But it's a non-normative conception of science. All Hayek is committed to is saying, yes, the switch to Keynesianism was progressive in the sense that a lot of people made that switch. But he's not committed to saying that that's a good thing, or that they should have done that, or that was progressive in a normative sense. I mean, he's not committed to that. It's just a lot of people made the switch. He's just describing, or I'm trying to give an account according to which we can describe what happens in science. Yes?
So I think what some people are reflecting on is that you're telling a story that has of science, philosophy of science, that has no public choice in it. Whereas Tulloch, for instance, would say that there's some work within the order of scientific discovery that is rent-seeking.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And yet, from what I can see here, there is no kind of private incentives that you built into this. So David's point about private and public, you've got rational belief. What about people inside the scientific order? What about people outside the scientific order? Do they believe the same things?
Well, again, I think I would have to refer you there to Butos's work on this, because they're the ones that have the more elaborate models of how scientists are signaled to respond in various ways to changes in the scientific order. And so they do have an...
They have incentives as well, and they create the signals. They
Right.
by acting a certain way. And sometimes the way in which they're acting yields something closer to truth, that way. And sometimes it yields more useless discoveries.
Right.
So to the extent that you could pull that in, or maybe it's not in that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's part of it. I think that you're simply not going to get a public choice story about how science operates out of Hayek. Now, I would probably agree that a comprehensive philosophy of science needs to have that sort of an element incorporated into it. I mean, one of the ways that I conceive of the Hayekian research program that I'm trying to advance is as a sort of the epistemic counterpoint to public choice. You know, it's especially the politics as a knowledge problem element is, whereas public choice focuses on the incentives of politicians, the Hayekian political epistemology really focuses on their knowledge. And I think that you can get very similar, the two approaches can be combined. They're very complementary. And I think that treating politics as a knowledge problem leads you into a certain public choice perspective about how, public choice analysis about how government fails. But it's sort of a complementary explanation of how government fails. It's a knowledge problem rather than an incentive problem. Yes?
Following Stanley's comment, and I put it as a hypothesis for you to react to the extent that you build, I think it also goes to David's point, you build in incentives, you build in purpose and calculation, and to that extent you move away from spontaneity. And so I'm having this constant, you see, I'm having this business of the beauty of this is the spontaneity. And once you allow incentive, once you incentivize the process, that is, if you like, muted.
Why are why can incentives? Okay, all right.
And in this, in it getting muted, it also possibly may suggest a demarcation in that there's stuff that does not allow you the sense of purpose and calculation. It's not science. A poem, there is no rent seeking in poetry. In a poem, there is no rent seeking because, it's spontaneous. It's not convention agreed upon. If it's to the extent that it's conventional, it's not poetry. It overturns the convention. It overturns the vocabulary. It makes its own vocabulary. Now, therefore, is there a demarcation? I don't know. I don't know how much, what Hayek would say to it too. I don't know what Bookshop would say. I'm just putting them on the table. I don't know. I want your studied reactions to this study from the viewpoint of Hayek.
Yeah, I don't see. I keep coming back. It's not clear to me. You started your comment by saying that once you build incentives, you start moving away from spontaneity, and I'm caught up on that. I don't see what you're. Why can incentives not be spontaneous? How can incentives not? How can they not be emergent?
The incentives mutes my spontaneous behavior. I don't just do goodness to you. I do because I expect to be reciprocated for the goodness that I will do to you.
But spontaneous.
Because you will give me a piece of candy.
But spontaneous behavior is not unconstrained behavior.
No, that's why I use the word muted. But maybe we should continue on.
I'm just not. Let's talk about this later because I'm just not. I want to understand the point. I'm just not seeing it. Yes, George.
Question about this, but I do want to hear you talk about fire audits. So my question is,
Ah.
if I hold my question now, do you have a chance to talk about fire audits?
I can give you. Well, let's get to the methodological liberalism stuff, and then we'll talk about fire audit. Okay. So back to where we were. Effective social control requires knowledge adequate to the realization of the relevant goal. That's just Hayek's prediction in control point, okay? So Hayek basically argues that in order to control, you need to be able to predict. If you can't predict, you can't control. Okay, so that's all that says. Effective social control requires knowledge, requires predictions. What can we draw out of that? Well, effective coercion, which is of course a form of social control, requires knowledge adequate to the realization of the goals of the would-be coercer. So whatever it is that the coercer is trying to get you to do, in order to get you to do it effectively, yeah. In order to get you to coerce effectively, the coercer needs to know how to do that. Needs to have a theory of how to coerce you into doing what he wants you to do. Where scientific outcomes are ecologically rational, the would-be coercer's knowledge is necessarily limited. That's what it means for an outcome to be ecologically rational. Okay, the knowledge that we would use to reconstruct the order is not available. So the would-be coercer's knowledge is limited in that case, and so is the affection of coercion as a scientific method. If the coercer does not possess the knowledge necessary to coerce effectively, he can't do so. 1 second, Andrew. Thus, the effectiveness of coercion as a scientific method is limited by the extent that ecologically rationality operates in science. Andrew.
Just real quick, why not just say policy maker instead of coercer? Too low.
Well, because in this particular context, the coercer may not be a policymaker. The coercer may be another scientist or a scientific community. Okay? So it need not... What's that?
Just say actor. The actor wants X. They need to know.
Yeah, okay, all right.
Yeah, but I mean, when a scientific community says these kinds of arguments are acceptable and take them seriously, and those kinds of arguments aren't, isn't that coercion? And
Yeah, again, the conclusion is not that coercion doesn't work sometimes. It does work sometimes. I actually think the science is a fairly coercive activity in the sense that we're all parts of scientific communities. We're all being ground down by those scientific communities in various ways, being told what to do or being incentivized in various ways to do different kinds of things. So the conclusion of this is not that that sort of coercion never works. It's just that there are some cases in which it doesn't work. If there are ecologically rational scientific outcomes, those can't be coerced.
Okay, well, actually, this is connected to
Okay.
this issue of ecologic rationality, because it keeps coming up, right?
Right.
And your discussion is very, very abstract. I would say, you know, if you're going to present this stuff again, as you're going to, one example of what you mean by ecological rationality would be useful.
Would you rather an example or a definition?
I think a concrete example,
Okay.
but let me make this follow-up point, which is that science is different from other kinds of endeavors in the sense that it's raison d'etre, the reason that we have it, is to provide constructivist explanations of things, to say, this is why things happen, right?
Right.
In some sense, I'm getting the impression that what you mean by ecological rationality concerns the aspects of science that fall within the realm of the sociology of science. What do you have to do to persuade your peers to get published, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, that's probably a fair point. I haven't thought about it too much, but I think, if I do, I think there might be a way in which the evidentiary aspect of science could be ecological as well, in which it's not. Yeah. So that would be the case if, for example, we weren't prepared to accept either verificationism or falsificationism as an account of how we engage with evidence. You know, if those, one could argue that those are not the right accounts, in which case there's something else, or there's something different. And right now, the best we can say about it is that, well, it seems to work in some way. We can't really put our hands on it, and that's kind of what we mean by ecological rationality in a way, is we can't reconstruct it, but it seems to have some sort of order to it, seems to have some sort of pattern to it, but we're limited to kind of describing how that pattern might work, but we can't really fill in the details of the pattern very well. Oh, okay.
Between the content of the science and the pattern of the organizational science. And it looks like you want to make claims about possible uses of the content, following from the claims about the order patterns. So if we think about engineering sciences that have nothing to do with
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I'm not sure that it's there, because when you mention content, I'm not sure where I see the reference to content.
Well, no, you're equivocating on two notions of science, I think. You're using both ordered patterns and something about the stuff that science is about interchangeably in your description. Because when we're talking about the uses of science by coercers or agents or policymakers, they're using the attributes of science. They're not using the ordered patterns of science.
Scott, I want to make sure you get to the end. So,
Yeah. I'm gonna jump. Let's talk about. Okay, so let's get to Feyerabend. All right. So basically, I'm trying to establish that there are cases in which, if science is a Hayekian complex phenomena, there can be cases in which there are rational scientific outcomes, by which I mean in the context of justification or rational belief, in the context of discovery, scientific discoveries. So there are going to be outcomes like that are going to be ecologically rational in the sense that we can't reconstruct them. And if we can't reconstruct them, we can't coerce them. And if we can't coerce them, we have to have an element of liberalism there. So that's basically the argument, and I think now we're ready for questions about Feyerabend. Okay, so do you want me just to give you my spiel on Feyerabend? Okay, so what is the difference between a methodological liberal and a methodological anarchist? According to the methodological liberal, there are going to be, so Feyerabend says anything goes. The methodological liberal does not say anything goes. The methodological liberal says you are going to be constrained by the scientific communities in which you operate. There are going to be good reasons, traditions, customs, habits, by which I mean scientific traditions, scientific customs, scientific habits that emerge from the community in which you exist. And those traditions, customs, et cetera, are going to constrain you in various ways. So it's not like anything goes. But you are free in the sense that there are certain advances. This is the whole progress point. There are certain advances that can only be made if you break out of that custom, habit, tradition. Remember what Hayek says about how, about the shift from tribal societies to competitive societies. What happened? Well, some people stopped following the traditional rules. They started trading. What I'm suggesting is that what distinguishes a methodological liberal from a methodological anarchist, the methodological liberal recognizes those constraints and also that in order to progress, you have to sometimes break those constraints. Go ahead. I'll get to you in a second, Andrew.
I don't think that this description is compelling. I mean, Feyerabend is offering a heuristic on the argument that we don't know which of those conventions, norms, practices, rules of the lab are going to be beneficial in the next case, and which ones are going to be detrimental. So let's act as if we don't know all of those, and let's be really open-minded about different scientific practices, approaches that don't conform, because we just never know. Seems perfectly consistent with everything we've been talking about in terms of ecological rationality. So at the end of the paper, I'm just worried that we're going too much of placing too much of a divide between, say, Feyerabend on the one hand and your approach on the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one difference might be this. When Feyerabend says all those wonderful things about we don't know, we need to just try different things, he's doing it from what Hayek would count as a constructivist perspective. He's not.
Why does that matter? That's what I saw that in your paper. I couldn't figure out why that matters. That's where Feyerabend is coming from. It might be a philosophical interesting point.
Right.
But in terms of what it actually prescribes to this community of scientists.
They look almost identical. I will grant you that point. In terms of how they look to the community of scientists, they look.
Which is why it matters, because this is a prescription for science. It's science.
Yeah, but it's not. Again, this is not meant to be normative. It's meant to be a description that has this implication.
This piece is normative.
It has this implication that if you want these kinds of outcomes, you have to allow an element of freedom. That's the only normative element involved. But I mean, an element of freedom, so I mean, maybe the difference here is this. An element of freedom is not the same thing as Feyerabend's anarchism, complete freedom. On a Hayekian perspective, you're still going to be somewhat constrained by the community in which you operate. I mean, George, I grant you that it's not. They're not. The two views are not separated by an ancient ocean. They're very similar. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it. Andrew, let me get your question real quick.
Real quickly, related to what George said, Tulloch's come up a couple of times. Would you classify Tulloch as a methodological liberal or an anarchist, more like Feyerabend? Because in class, Tulloch was anything goes. Tulloch was spoon bending. You know, go take the spoon bending angle, you might not get a good job, but try anything. You know, who knows where it's going to lead? If people like it, they like it. If they don't, too bad.
Yeah, you know, the strange thing about Tulloch, from a philosophical perspective, is that the organization of inquiry is written, as David and Sandy will talk about tomorrow, I assume, under the influence of Karl Popper. And so, thinking about Tulloch as a possible methodological anarchist while he's being advised by Popper is a very strange juxtaposition. So, he was, but he moved away and away and away. Anyways, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.